On the morning of December 16, 1944, the quiet forests of the Ardennes erupted into one of the most dramatic surprises of the Second World War. In near total secrecy, 3 German armies, numbering more than 200,000 men, launched a massive counter-offensive against a thinly held stretch of the Allied front line. Their objective was bold, almost desperate, to split the Allied forces in two, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a political collapse in the West that might still salvage Germany's collapsing war effort. By late 1944, the situation for Nazi Germany had become increasingly dire. After the Allied landings in Normandy and the Soviet Union's relentless advance from the east, German forces were being squeezed on all fronts. Entire regions had been lost, industrial resources were drying up, and Allied bombing was steadily eroding what remained of Germany's production capacity. Inside the regime, even senior officials understood the reality. The war could no longer be won in any conventional sense. Yet Adolf Hitler, unwilling to accept defeat, searched for a single decisive operation that might reverse the momentum. That gamble took shape in the Ardennes. German planners believed the forested terrain would conceal their movements and allow them to achieve surprise, just as it had in 1940 during the invasion of France. The plan called for a rapid armored thrust through weak American positions, crossing the Meuse River and racing toward Antwerp. If successful, it would cut off Allied supply lines and potentially fracture the coalition holding Western Europe. Meanwhile, Allied forces in the region were not anticipating a major offensive. Many American units stationed in the Ardennes sector were inexperienced, understrength, or recovering from months of continuous advance. The area itself was considered quiet and unsuitable for large-scale operations, leading Allied commanders to treat it as a secondary front. This combination of German secrecy and Allied complacency created the conditions for one of the most unexpected and dramatic battles of the war. When the German attack finally began, it triggered a month-long struggle of extraordinary intensity. From frozen forests to shattered villages, the Battle of the Bulge would become the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army in World War II, testing both sides to their limits and ultimately deciding the fate of Germany's last major offensive in the West. As dawn broke on December 16, 1944, the German offensive struck with overwhelming force across the Ardennes. Under cover of darkness and winter fog, artillery batteries opened fire along a wide front, shaking the frozen forests and signaling the start of Hitler's last major gamble in the West. Behind the bombardment came waves of infantry and armored units pushing forward in tight columns, attempting to break through thinly held American positions before reinforcements could arrive. The German plan relied heavily on speed, surprise, and the assumption that bad weather would neutralize Allied air superiority. For the first hours, this seemed to work. In several sectors, especially in the central Ardennes, American defenders were scattered, underprepared, and overwhelmed by the scale of the attack. Some units were quickly pushed back, creating gaps in the line that German armored spearheads rushed to exploit. However, the terrain of the Ardennes quickly turned from an advantage into a major obstacle. Narrow, winding forest roads became congested with vehicles, slowing entire divisions into traffic jams. Tanks, artillery, supply wagons, and infantry units all competed for the same limited routes. What was meant to be a rapid breakthrough began to lose momentum almost immediately as coordination broke down under pressure. and the Germans struggled to maintain supply lines over rapidly extending distances. In the northern sector, German forces encountered unexpectedly strong resistance at key defensive positions such as the Elsenborn Ridge. Here, American troops, though outnumbered, used well-prepared defensive positions and artillery support to stall repeated attacks. The dense forest and fortified terrain negated much of the German advantage in armor, forcing costly frontal assaults that yielded little progress. In the center, German panzer divisions initially achieved deeper penetrations, taking advantage of weakly held American positions. Entire units were forced to retreat in confusion, and communication breakdowns made it difficult for Allied commanders to understand the full scale of the offensive. For a brief moment, it appeared that the German plan might succeed in reaching the Meuse River. In the south, the attack was slower and more disorganized. Units of the German 7th Army struggled with inadequate transport, poor equipment, and strong defensive fire from American artillery. Many formations became pinned on riverbanks or stalled in difficult terrain, unable to advance as planned. As the first day ended, both sides began to realize the magnitude of what had begun. For the Germans, early gains came at the cost of exhausted units, fuel shortages, and growing logistical chaos. For the Americans, initial confusion gradually gave way to recognition that this was no limited counterattack, but a major strategic offensive requiring immediate response. Over the following days, Allied command rapidly shifted forces toward the breach. Reinforcements were redirected, reserves were mobilized, and plans for other operations were temporarily suspended. Crucially, improved coordination between American Corps commanders helped stabilize the situation. One of the most critical turning points came at Bastogne, a key road junction surrounded by German forces. Here, elements of the 101st Airborne Division held out under siege conditions, refusing repeated German demands to surrender. Despite shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, the defenders maintained control of the town long enough for relief forces to arrive. The famous reply, "Nuts," became a symbol of American resistance during the battle. As the weather cleared in late December, the balance of the battlefield shifted dramatically. Allied aircraft, previously grounded by fog and cloud cover, returned in overwhelming numbers. German columns, once hidden, were now exposed to constant air attack. Supply convoys were destroyed. Armored units were harassed from above, and movement during daylight became increasingly impossible. By the end of December, the German offensive had lost its momentum. Fuel shortages, mounting casualties, and destroyed equipment prevented further advances. What had begun as a bold attempt to fracture the Allied front had turned into a desperate struggle to hold shrinking gains in the face of coordinated Allied counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge was now transitioning from a German offensive into an Allied encirclement and rollback operation. By early January 1945, the final phase of the Battle of the Bulge had become a slow, grinding retreat for the German forces. What had begun as a bold attempt to split the Allied armies and seize Antwerp had collapsed into a desperate effort simply to avoid destruction. Exhausted German units, low on fuel, ammunition, and replacement manpower, found themselves increasingly unable to resist coordinated Allied pressure from both north and south. As the weather improved, Allied air power became one of the decisive factors on the battlefield. Fighter bombers roamed freely over German positions, striking supply columns, armored formations, and road junctions with devastating effect. What little mobility the German offensive had relied on was effectively destroyed. Movement during daylight became nearly impossible, forcing remaining units to operate at night under constant strain and confusion. On the ground, American and British forces steadily closed the gap around the German salient. Village by village, forest by forest, the front line was pushed back. Heavily fortified towns were reduced through combined arms assaults, where artillery barrages and armor-supported infantry advances overwhelmed remaining resistance. German troops, many of them inexperienced conscripts or hastily assembled formations, struggled to hold positions under relentless pressure. One of the most significant strategic shifts came when Allied command fully committed reserves to contain and eliminate the Bulge. This rapid redeployment, combined with improved coordination between American Corps and British forces in the northern sector, ensured that the German advance could not be revived. Attempts at localized counterattacks failed to restore momentum, and entire divisions were gradually worn down or encircled. Meanwhile, inside Germany, the situation was deteriorating further. The Ardennes offensive had consumed critical reserves of fuel, armor, and trained personnel, resources that could not be replaced. Even as propaganda attempted to present the operation as a temporary setback, military reality told a different story. The Wehrmacht had lost its last operational capacity for large-scale offensive warfare in the West. By mid-January, Allied forces linked up near Houffalize, effectively sealing the fate of the German salient. What remained of the offensive collapsed into scattered defensive actions and withdrawals. On January 28, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially declared over. The cost of the battle was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or went missing, while entire towns and villages across Belgium and Luxembourg lay in ruins. Civilian populations endured occupation, reprisals, displacement, and destruction as the front surged back and forth through their homeland in the depths of winter. Strategically, the battle marked a decisive turning point in the final year of the war in Western Europe. Germany's last major offensive had failed not only to achieve its objectives, but had accelerated the collapse of its military position. The loss of experienced troops and irreplaceable equipment left the Western Front irreversibly weakened. In the weeks that followed, the Allies resumed their advance into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine and pushing toward the industrial heartland of the Reich. The illusion of German strategic initiative in the West had been permanently shattered. The Battle of the Bulge ended as it began, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, but its consequences reached far beyond them. It was the final major gamble of a collapsing regime, and when the snow finally settled, it marked the beginning of the end of the war in Europe.